This week in post, a teardown of an infrared landscape photo. Hey everybody, I'm Scott Davenport and welcome to In Post. Thanks for joining me today. If this is the first time you're checking out one of my videos, thanks for giving me a shot. I hope you like what you see and you'll come on back and watch a few more. So today's photo is an infrared shot. I shared the behind the scenes of the outing that led to this photo on In the Field earlier this week, so you can go check that out. And this is an infrared photo, and what I want to really point out is I've talked about infrared photography on my vlog a couple of times, and my process has changed ever so slightly, and I'll point that out as we go through the teardown of this, of exactly where that's changed. But let's get into this photo. So here is the final image, and I really like it. It's had good conditions as far as the sky was concerned, and everything else just kind of fell into place. But let's use the snapshots we have in Lightroom to walk through this. So I have a bunch we'll go through. First is the original. So this is the photo straight out of camera. And now my camera is infrared. That's an A7R converted camera, 830 nanometers. What that means, it's black and white. I'm not capturing color infrared. I like black and white infrared, so that was, personal choice. Check out my vlog for all the details on, why I made that choice and all that sort of stuff. But what happens here is, we don't have a quite correct white balance. There's this reddish cast to it. Now my process previously, and I've talked about how to create these, was to use a particular camera profile that I had created. So these profiles down here, I had this Sony A7R deep black and white infrared, and I had one where I'd done, some additional work on it. So I can select either of these and you can kind of see the differences there. And this used to be my starting point. It's not perfect, but the notion was to be able to have adjustments available for the white balance to get that color cast out of there and get things back into a good starting point. But since Adobe's update, I want to show you this, and I'm going to be very careful where I put my mouse so I can pop in and out of it. So I'm going to hover over Adobe Monochrome and then back out and back in. Adobe Monochrome is doing a really good job with the infrared photo, and just a single click from straight out of camera to the Adobe Monochrome profile, I've got a great starting point, and I can start to dial in, the other settings that I need. And I don't even have to worry too much about white balance per se. I have other tools I can shift things around. So that's been a big change to my workflow. I'm not using my custom profile anymore. And so how I work is I'll just come in here and choose Adobe Monochrome, and that is now my starting point for all of my infrared photos. And that is in fact the next little checkpoint we have, a little snapshot. Now let's move on to basic panel. What happened in basics? Well, you can see we got a lot of things going on. It's a much richer photo now. See, contrast has been increased, exposure has been increased. I'm not worrying too much about the high end, at least with the conversion that I have. If I try to push those whites all the way to the edge, things tend to get a little bit, muddy and blurred. No, not blurred. It's not like it's not sharp, but the tones become too similar in the highlights. I haven't enjoyed that look very much. We'll see how close this gets to the edge toward the end of the processing. You can see it toned in the highlights. This is all standard stuff, opening up shadows. That was really a lot for this dark area down here, adding a little bit of clarity. From here, it's really kind of like any other landscape photo. You just start working those sliders to get the tones reasonably in order. Next step was the tone curve. Now we'll see that nudge things over a little bit. Let me open up the tone curve. So something I'm doing with the tone curve is I like to grab this point here, and normally this is where it lives, and I'll just drag it to the left until it's right up against the edge of the brightest tone that I have in my histogram. I could do this with the blacks and whites sliders in the basic panel, but I find once I get things relatively dialed in, I tend to want a tone curve anyway. And so I'll go in here, and if I have to bring in the black point or the white point, I'll do it there. And I did an ever so slightly gentle S-curve on this. So before the tone curve and after, you see the brights are a little brighter, shadows were a little bit darker, but really this is just reining in. Let me get that back up to the top there. This is just reining in those highlights to make sure I've got a good crisp, brightest point. Moving on. Our next is deepening the sky and the shadows, and so we'll watch the background become deeper. That was done with a graduated filter, And if I hover over that pin, you'll see that there is a selection going on here where I'm avoiding the highlights, really getting midtones and deep shadows. And if I tap on that once, you can see I'm bringing the exposure down just ever so slightly. We're using a range mask to protect the highlights. Again, I'll hover over that so we can see what that mask looks like, just to really deepen the sky and the shadows. My first go around, I mainly did the sky, and that looked good, but I realized I wanted to deepen the shadows in between the trees to really give those trees more depth, more dimension. The next step is the midground. So a similar idea. So we're going to see the midground get a little crisper, a little bit darker. I used a radial filter for that so that I could just sweep all around this area here. If I hover over that, you'll see the really simple, no masking whatsoever, nothing fancy with the gradients, just adjusting some sliders, adding a little contrast, tugging back on highlights, adding a little clarity. And this is my subject ultimately, and I want to make sure that my viewer sees this garage barn structure here with the truck that's hooked up to the trailer. I'm thinking this is a horse carrier of some type. Cool like farm type looking scene here. Let's go on to the next snapshot. This was a vignette. So instead of using the vignette tool that we have down in effects, I used another radial filter. And that's so I could bias the center of the filter over this, I'll call it the garage. I didn't want to have the vignette just straight on from the center. That's what we get with the effects panel. I can use a radial filter and put the center wherever I like it, and then just set the sliders to taste, set the feather about 45, a little bit down on the exposure. And so the sum of those two, this will be two radial filters before and after. It's accentuating and drawing the eye in better to this main subject here. And the last step was opening up the shadows. And so this was a little bit dark. And so that last pin, if I hover over that, you can see that we're targeting mainly the shadows. I'm removing things from the highlights. So again, this is a range mask, luminance. But those three radial filters, we had one for the midground, we had one that was a vignette, and then one that was targeting these shadow areas, all with the purpose of collectively emphasizing this subject. So before all of that, and then after. And so add it all up, and this is the end result. So I'm going to hit the backslash key to see the original photo, and then the final shot. And so the tip of the week is the Adobe Profiles that have been added to the new Lightroom CC, Lightroom Classic. That monochrome one, at least for a black and white converted IR camera, is working really, really well. And if you haven't watched my other video that explains how I go and created the camera profile using the DNG profiler and so forth, now you don't have to. I would say if you're looking for black and white infrared, try one of those camera profiles. I am curious, for those that have a color converted IR camera, if any of the camera profiles are working well for color conversions. If you can leave a comment below, because share the knowledge, let everyone else know what you're finding out, because I guess I'm cautiously optimistic after what I've seen happen with the black and white. Maybe one of those other profiles will help out with color IR as well. Well, that's going to do it for this week's In Post. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please let me know somehow. Comments on the video below, comments through my website. You can contact me however you like. I'm in a whole bunch of different places on social media, and I hope to hear from you soon. Tell me what's on your mind photographically. Until next time, my name is Scott Davenport. Happy shooting.